And we are back on the 0 Hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest reports on the politics of the Democratic Party and of progressive movements in general. So I'm sure he's been a busy man lately. He's also a very old friend of mine and of the program. Daniel Marans is a reporter for HuffPost, as it is now called. I still can't get used to that after all these years. Without any further ado, Daniel, welcome back to the program.
Great to be here, Richard.
Great to have you. And let me start with this, if you don't mind. I'm going to kind of just throw a broad question at you. But I've been really curious about this because your beat is the Democratic Party and the progressive movement. And there's a lot of talk about, shifting the party and being more progressive and Biden thinking bigger than people expected, more FDR likes, et cetera, et cetera. From your point of view, just working this beat every day, making calls, I guess it's a virtually all calls now. I was going to say visiting people, making calls, but reaching out to people in the party, in the progressive movement, independently, and so on. Does it feel differently to you? Does it feel as if something has shifted, or is it just too abstract right now, too hard to tell because of the pandemic?
Well, I don't want to overstate it. I personally reject the FDR and LBJ comparisons because he hasn't yet created any permanent social programs. And I think the expanded child tax credit may very well become that. And that's sort of the most bold and radical element of the American Rescue Plan. He obviously has a number of policies that could be heading in that direction, but I think a lot remains to be seen. What is true is that against the benchmark of Barack Obama, who enjoyed much larger majorities in the House and the US Senate, Joe Biden has been far more willing to defy what we might call neoliberal conventional wisdom on questions like budget deficits, on questions like bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake, and now more recently on the question of intellectual property being the kind of be-all, end-all that if we infringe on it even in the slightest way, the sky will fall.
Yeah, and that's been my sense, and I've been trying to, get a gut feel about it. I just can't get one yet. But no, you kind of describe my perceptions to a certain extent in terms of Biden, and then in terms of the way people are reacting to it, it almost seems to me, Daniel, as if the staunch progressives in the House and independently haven't yet found their footing in this new world of Bidenism. I mean, I saw Pramila Jayapal, who's a big supporter of hers, been on the program and all that. But I saw her quoted as saying that she would give Biden up to now an A, and thought, well, there's nothing he can do, not Medicare for all, nothing. But I feel...
And how about foreign policy? I mean, we don't even...
Well, yes, thank you.
That's a big glaring hole, I think, so.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you for bringing that up. So I feel that it's almost as if the independent progressive movement needs new language and new lenses to see this world through. Do you know what I'm driving at?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I think when you're in the position of sort of saying, oh, well, we're pleasantly surprised, tactically that can be very smart. But the question then becomes, if the establishment has co-opted some of the more popular ideas, have they co-opted your whole agenda? Does that mean you no longer need to be as independent? Or are you holding your fire unduly? And that is a real question. I mean, I think we're going to see that going forward. And I really think that we've passed the easiest period of the Biden presidency, which is the COVID-19 relief period. Keep in mind here, when we talk about COVID-19 relief, I hate to say it, but President Trump did a whole lot of things that wouldn't be considered traditionally conservative either. I mean, the CARES Act, I think in retrospect, was one of the more generous relief packages we've had in the past few decades. You know, he at least didn't veto the cash payments and the bumped up unemployment benefits, and in fact, later essentially handed Democrats a cudgel by doing his sort of fickle intervention, deciding that he really liked the $2,000 checks. There was a little bit of a creative destruction happening there in that Trump presidency on some of these fiscal issues. But as we step out of, I think, this relief period and step into infrastructure spending, do progressives say if it doesn't have home health care work, it's no good for us, and force Joe Manchin's hand? Do progressives say we won't vote for a bipartisan, watered down HR 1 on voting rights, on the issue of gerrymandering, and on campaign finance reform, and instead try to force the abolition of the filibuster? I mean, those are the types of questions that we're going to be looking at, because I think everybody would agree that even with whatever economic sort of momentum Biden's going to have, under his wings, it's going to be hard to hold Congress in 2022. Yep. So it's that 2-year phenomenon, and I think those are the types of things that I'm going to be looking at coming up. We're talking here today, obviously, about the question of pharmaceutical policy as it relates to the global community, but HR 3, which is the drug price bill that would put pharma into check domestically, is going to be up again in the House, and that's another thing where it remains to be seen what Biden will really do on drug prices. And again, I think that one concern that I would have if I were to take off my journalist hat and put on my progressive individual hat is that in the interest of trying to distinguish themselves, people on the left adopt more and more over the top cultural rhetoric that maybe resonates with a closer base, but doesn't necessarily move the needle on policy, rather than really following Biden's lead and saying, where can we press our advantage on popular things? Because that's essentially what he's done with the progressive agenda. He said, I like this, that I don't know, that's going to cost me votes. I think that that at times we can learn from what the centrists have seen as available tools in the progressive toolkit, because they are often more nakedly short-term in their thinking in terms of politics. So keep it popular, press your advantage on that, and use those issues to force Biden's hand. That would be sort of my advice.
Well, one obvious way to do that, Daniel Marans, would be, you've been reporting a lot on the drug issue, on the sort of, I'll call them pro-drug company Democrats versus the ones, the many members of the Democratic coalition who came out calling for a vaccine waiver, which it looks like Biden now supports. Excuse me. But it seems to me that turning that into live policy is going to be a matter of saying, particularly when it gets to the Senate, does the left take a popular position like that? Which, you were mentioning popular, right? Taking a stand on popular position. That's a popular position, controlling drug prices. If a Joe Manchin or somebody, Kyrsten Sinema, says, nope, we don't want it, at what point does the left say, borrow a page from the right and the Republican Party and say, we're not passing your bill if you don't have HR 3 or the equivalent, if you don't give us that? Do you see that? You think there's a chance that could happen, or is the left just being too get along, go along right now?
Well, I'm not going to pass an explicit value judgment on whether they are or are not or will be to go along to get along. But I will make a prediction, which is that I do not think that the Progressive Caucus in particular has the, let's say, cojones, forgive the gendered term, to play ball like that. I recently interviewed Pramila Jayapal for a story about her endorsement of Nina Turner. And in it, we talked about how the Progressive Caucus is expanding and a bunch of different issues. And I asked her about this. I said, will we see, right now that the Democratic majority in the House is something like 5 or 6 votes, every day another octogenarian Dem House member dies or retires. So, it changes regularly. But I said, will, last time around, the one time you guys really threatened to sink something, to deep six something, was this prescription drug bill, HR 3. And what they got, I don't know whether what they got for that threat was enough, but at least it showed some maneuverability, which is that the minimum number of prescription drugs the government would be haggling over went from 25 to 35.
Right.
And she sort of said to me, I said, when I look at, different items on your agenda, whether it's infrastructure, DC statehood, issues related to the filibuster, or just prescription drugs, probably of all those, prescription drugs and infrastructure are the most politically popular. Do you plan to use the fact that Nancy Pelosi now has a slightly smaller margin of error? She said, well, we get in earlier in the process. We lobby behind closed doors. We lobby in committee. And when it comes to actually threatening to withhold a vote or literally withholding a vote on the floor, that's always a tough call for us, because the question is this better than nothing? And we sort of take this earnest approach to policymaking. And of course, if you're a Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema, you could take or leave prescription drug regulation. And so you have more leverage inherently. But there is just, I think that we know historically, and from the example of the Freedom Caucus, that sometimes there's an element of inherent value in showing you're willing to shoot the hostage, showing you're willing to be the terrorist, and that the gains that could generate in the medium and long term in terms of internal power dynamics would pay dividends, because it would genuinely shock people, and they wouldn't like it, but they'd have to eat it. I think at this point they clearly have the votes to do that in certain circumstances, given the smaller Dem House majority and the larger group of what we might call core left-wing progressives. But again, based on my reporting, not quite the appetite to do that. If I were to sort of speculate about what's going on behind the curtain here, people don't like confrontation.
Mm-hmm. Some people don't. Right.
And when what the Freedom Caucus really had going for them was that they had outside money that was willing to say, sure, go to war with Boehner, go to war with Paul Ryan. I don't know that there's quite that level of strength in terms of left-wing infrastructure right now. There is a level of support for candidates that are trying to break in with that approach. But once they're there, is there that money there for them? I'm not quite sure. Is there a legislative operation, a lobbying outside operation that is able to sort of generate that public support? I'm not sure. And I just don't think, I've seen, for example, the way AOC has gone back and forth between a diplomatic approach to her colleagues and an outright don't give a hoot approach of they're going to hate me anyway and I welcome their hatred. And just speaking personally, I have to think how I would feel going into an office place if all my colleagues hated me and trashed me in the press. And they're kind of already doing that, but right now there's a slight détente. So
That's interesting. Yeah. You know, Daniel, I also wonder to what extent, when you're talking about, for example, Pramila Jayapal or other people in similar positions, progressive leadership in the House or Senate, well, she's a perfect example. She has, in effect, two constituencies, right? She has her own district, but then she has the members of her caucus, too. So I wonder to what extent this slightly diffident or however you want to characterize it stance, ambivalent stance, isn't partly because it might be that if they wanted to take a tough stand, she'd be there, Ro Khanna would be there, the squad would be there, but we could name some other members of that caucus. And maybe they don't like that so much. Maybe they'd drop out of the caucus and it would lose. She made the tactical decision to make it smaller and more ideologically coherent, which I think was smart, but it can't be too small. So I wonder to what extent maybe some of the progressives aren't holding their fire because they're trying to keep a coalition together. What do you think?
I don't think that quite plays right now. I mean, look, you could ask about secondary effects. If 10 of them take a stand against a bill, and on a partisan bill right now with the numbers in the House, that's probably enough. So you're really talking about the squad, Roe, Mondaire Jones, Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, maybe you get Chuy Garcia in there or what have you. You don't need quite that many people. But does that cause an exodus from people who are turned off by that as a secondary effect? Possibly. You mentioned that people have been pushing her to develop a smaller but more ideologically coherent caucus. She adopted some rules to that effect, that you have to vote with the caucus 2/3 of the time, that she consolidated her leadership under her rule. And actually, one person did end up leaving, Angie Craig of Minnesota. Interestingly, though, Angie Craig was on the letter calling for Biden to support the pharmaceutical patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines, and 22 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, people like, let's say, Hakeem Jeffries, Frank Pallone, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, did not. So these are still distinctions that lack some of the weight that people would like them to have.
And yet, Hakeem Jeffries, who, was never, to be honest, my ideological mate, I would say, in this world, and we're not twin flames ideologically, but Hakeem Jeffries, who didn't sign that letter, did sign the letter calling for lowering the Medicare age and expanding its coverage to include vision and dental, if I remember correctly. So I feel as if, maybe we can close with this. I feel as if the Democratic Party's wings and factions and distinctions, they're getting blurry and messy, and I know some people do things for the symbolic value. It seems to me fewer people are signing on to the Medicare for All bill this year because they feel they don't have to, and I know some of this is fainting left and all that, but it's starting to feel a little bit like looking into a kaleidoscope to me when I try to look at the ideological makeup of the Democratic Party. And I don't know, maybe we can close with, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the more interesting figures here is a guy like Jared Golden, who is in one of the more vulnerable positions of any House Democrat. He represents rural northern Maine, the geographically vast but sparsely populated second Maine congressional district, as opposed to the one that has Portland in it. And he actually voted against the American Rescue Plan, seemingly to be able to say that he, voted against Biden's agenda, but he's a Medicare for All supporter and has taken a tough line on prescription drugs. The politics of this does seem to be swaying a little bit. But again, as you note, the question always becomes, what do you do when the actual chips are down and these things have an impact and are not just symbolic? And right. I think that remains a big open question. But I have to tell you, having covered this now for a couple of weeks and looking at even just yesterday the way Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, was responding to questions about the international patent waiver, saying, well, we're not the only ones in the WTO. You have to understand that, right? Which is, of course, sort of like saying America's not the only one in the IMF. Everybody knows who calls the shots anyway. And well, sure, Joe Biden made this promise as a candidate, but he has a process now. I was just like, wow, they're grasping at straws. And we were hearing a lot of things from them that indicated that they were echoing industry talking points about how this wouldn't provide immediate relief for the world's vaccine shortage and all of that, which is somewhat beside the point because it may be necessary but not sufficient. And then to just hear an hour or two later that whatever internal debate was being had inside the White House was resolved in favor of global public health advocates and against the pharmaceutical industry, though there are a number of details that needs to still be hammered out in terms of what this negotiation ends up looking like. And of course, now the Europeans are making their objections known. That was an absolute stunner to me, and a sign that I don't know exactly what it is about Joe Biden or what it is about the current circumstances, perhaps, but he has been more receptive to pressure from the left than Obama, and maybe just more open to new policy arguments as well. And since many or most mainstream Democrats seem to follow his lead, I think that has a quote unquote trickle down effect.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things I always said about Biden is he has much more of a need to be liked than Obama did, which in the end may be a plus for progressive ideas, especially the ones that are popular. So it's a really interesting time to have your beat, Daniel. So I hope you're enjoying it. Again, my guest has been Daniel Marans, political reporter for HuffPost. And Dan, as always, thanks for the great reporting. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Always great to be here, Richard.
And we'll be right back. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.